Well, with that, I'd now like to formally welcome everyone to this session. And as always, we'd like to thank the Center for the Study of World Religions for hosting us. We're really grateful for the facility and the food that we have. The colloquium is an opportunity for cross-disciplinary conversation to explore how individuals and communities have drawn on religious and spiritual resources to foster mutual understanding, well-being, cooperation, justice, and peace across differences of religion, sect, nationality, ethnicity, and culture, and how such efforts can inform contemporary peace-building theory and practice. We also want to think together about what more universities can do to help foster constructive relations across differences worldwide, and in particular what scholars of religion can contribute in this domain in collaboration with scholars and practitioners from a variety of other fields. So tonight's session is on, quote, being peace, virtues, inner cultivation, and positive social influence, Hindu and Buddhist cases in comparative perspective, and implications for peace building. We have as our presenters a scholar of religion and a divinity student and experienced practitioner who will take us on to a deep dive into some insider religious perspectives on the practice of peace and what it requires. We've sent all of you a few questions in advance, and we'd like this to be a comparative conversation and invite your contributions from the vantage point of the religious traditions and peace-building approaches with which you're familiar. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, my colleague, Professor Diana Egg, who I do not see at the moment. Ah, Diana! The cold has affected my vision as much as everything else, who is also a very knowledgeable expert on tonight's subject. So Diana, thank you for moderating our discussion tonight.
Thank you, Dean Hampton. This is really a very special evening that I myself am quite interested in. For some 15 years over the course of teaching intro courses and others in the study of religion, especially religion today, two of the interlocutors that I have consistently assigned students to read are Gandhi and Thich Nhat Hanh, in part because both of them discovered their ways of thinking about peace and peacemaking, not somehow apart from society, but in the turbulence and fires of conflict. And so they're very relevant, I think, for our work this evening, and to look at some of the ideas that they have worked out. And for helping us get started on Gandhi and some views from the Hindu tradition, we have my special colleague, Anne Monius, who is a historian of religion. Yeah, you took the, did you take the Gandhi seminar when we had the two Gandhians from India, from Devaki and Lakshmi Jain? Yeah. Well, I mean, that's you know, that's one of my favorites. Now it's called Gandhi Then and Now. But she is a historian of religion who specializes in the religious traditions of India and looks at both practices and products of literary culture to reconstruct the history of religion in South India. And her landmark first book, The Imagining a Place for Buddhism, Literary Culture and Religious Communities in Tamil-Speaking South India, looks at the only two extant Tamil Buddhist texts and does a remarkable interpretation of the role of Tamil culture in South India, Tamil Buddhist culture, which many people don't really think about, and has now on the edge of completing Singing the Lives of Shiva's Saints, History, Aesthetics, and Religious Identity in Tamil-Speaking South India. And again, the role of aesthetics and moral vision in the articulation of a Hindu religious identity in the 12th century. Both point toward larger research focused on the ways in which aesthetics and ethics define religious identity and community in South Asia, as well as to the creative and productive encounters among competing sectarian religious communities. And some of her future research will explore the relation between Hindu devotional and philosophical literature in Tamil to its Sanskrit forebearers, as well as consider the transmission of South Indian strands of Buddhism and Hinduism to Southeast Asia. And then we also have Leslie Hubbard, who's going to talk about Thich Nhat Hanh in the Buddhist tradition. Leslie is currently a third-year MDiv candidate in Buddhist and East Asian Studies at HDS. And prior to this, she was a fully ordained Buddhist nun in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh for 8 years in his centers in France, Asia, and the U.S. And during her time there, Leslie served as an assistant to and frequently co-taught with Thich Nhat Hanh, both in his monasteries worldwide and during international teaching tours. Leslie is also one of the founding members of Blue Cliff Monastery in New York, where she served as executive director of programming and operations. And currently, in addition to her studies here at HDS, she leads mindfulness, meditation, health, and wellness workshops at Harvard Business School's executive education program, and works also with corporations in the Boston area. Leslie also leads Boston's Wake movement, started by Thich Nhat Hanh, to educate and inspire university students and young professionals to integrate mindfulness, ethics, and nonviolent social change into their studies and vocation. So with great pleasure, I welcome first Anne and then Leslie. I'm understanding that each of you gets 14 minutes. Is that correct? And who is the timekeeper this evening? That would be me? Okay, I'm coming. And when I say one, that means 1 minute left. And that's probably at 13 minutes. So you maybe could take 2 just to round it out.
Round it up to 15. Okay, thanks. Thanks very much for the nice introduction, Diana. For many of the world's religious traditions around the globe, issues of ethics, all issues of ethics, including ethics of peace building, really begin, I would argue, with a focus on individual personal ethics, with specific personal disciplinary practices, other kinds of disciplines, upon which the proper functioning of the larger social order is believed to rest. From the tradition that I primarily teach here, Hinduism, perhaps the most famous or infamous depiction of this fact is in the Bhagavad Gita, a celebrated Hindu text, very important to the figure I'll be talking about briefly, Mahatma Gandhi. When Arjuna, the great warrior, is sitting on the side of the battlefield, suddenly realizing that he's about to go into battle and kill his cousin brothers. The bow slips from his hand. He sits there dejected, and his charioteer, who is Krishna in disguise as his charioteer, says, "Buck up, Arjuna, you've got to fight." Because if you don't fulfill your individual moral duty as a warrior in the prime of life, your duty is to fight in the battle, what will happen? The first bad thing that's going to happen is women are going to start marrying people of other castes, and therein the entire, not only social, but also cosmological order will collapse. So everybody's individual dharmic duty adds up, in a sense, or ethical duty adds up to the proper functioning of society. And even if one person fails to fulfill that duty, then the entire order begins to collapse. Now, centuries of European colonization the world over certainly introduced other notions of ethics, including the very idea of what we would today call the public sphere. Many dissertations have been written, including 2 here, about the invention of the public sphere, the creation of the public sphere by both European and elites on the ground in colonial contexts of the public sphere all over the colonized world. But yet the natural impetus that we often have in times of conflict, in terms of conflict resolution, to think about issues of policy, of governmentality, of public action, is not always is not a ubiquitously shared impetus, I would argue, in many parts of the world. And many have argued, I'm not making this up, many have theorized this, that the creation of the public sphere in the post-colonial world is an ongoing and often deeply, deeply conflicted process. So although Gandhi and Thich Nhat Hanh are very, very different figures, drawing on very distinctive interpretations of their respective Hindu and Buddhist traditions, both, I would argue, share, and Leslie and I conferred beforehand, we're in agreement on this, both share a deep commitment to the idea that any kind of peace building, any kind of resolution to any conflict, no matter how broadly social, must begin with the cultivation of individual moral responsibility, courage, and virtue. Time is short this evening. I have the big 14 minutes to describe the work of Mahatma Gandhi, so I'm going to assume if you haven't read the book, you've seen the movie. And I'm going to bypass the biographical details, et cetera, use the most famous Hindu of the modern period. And I instead want to explain some of the basics of his techniques of nonviolent resistance to colonial rule of the British in the 20th century through his assassination in 1948. He always resisted the notion that this was passive resistance. He said there was nothing passive about it, but it was active but always nonviolent resistance to British rule. I'm going to start with the basic terminology he used for these campaigns. He called them satyagraha campaigns. Sat or satya is a word meaning truth. I'll come back to that in a minute. And gra is of a basic verbal form meaning to grasp or to seize. The long a gives it a directional, so it's a grasping after or a seizing after truth. And I think that's very telling about, he himself did not coin the term, one of his close male relatives did, but I think it's an excellent encapsulation of what the campaigns and those who continue Gandhian style campaigns today seek to do. And I think we have to begin with his radical reinterpretation of what he meant by Sat or Satya. On the one hand, he was a very devout Hindu, a worshiper of Vishnu, Krishna, another form of Vishnu, throughout his own personal religious practice. But he says over and over again in his writings and repeatedly to those who followed him and joined in his campaigns, that truth with a capital T is an unknown. It's not something you can organize or should organize your life around, because knowing that truth is ultimately going to liberate you from the bonds of human existence altogether. So he's not the first in Hindu tradition to distinguish between what are known as worldly truths versus ultimate truths, but he infuses it with a new spirit of activism. For him, the Sat or Satya in Satyagraha was a relative truth. And it was a relative truth in that it was always open to reconsideration in engaging with the opposing party or the opposite point of view. And that relative truth was always, for him, based on what we would call today social justice needs. The needs of, as he always said, the poorest of the poor. When in doubt, ask yourself, he often said to his followers and often wrote in various iterations, if you're in doubt about whether or not what you're going to do is the right place to start, ask yourself whether it's going to help the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized, the most downtrodden, the most oppressed. And one of the real brilliance of the Satyagraha campaigns that he himself led in colonial India was the specificity of the Sat, or the Satya. In other words, while he may not have disagreed with the idea that British colonialism was an evil, or that British colonial rule injured people, hurt people, that was never the proper cause of a Satyagraha campaign. His real brilliance lay in picking very particular. Sat was always wholly local. The truth of a situation, the truth toward which one should grasp, always had to be very local and very rooted in the needs of the poorest and most marginalized. So very famously, if you remember the movie, I'm going to refer to it freely. What is his first campaign? In 1917, he's only been back in India for a couple of years. He's approached at a rally in Calcutta after he gives a speech by a poor indigo farmer in an out-of-the-way place. His followers had to go look at a map to find where it was, called Champaram, in what is now southern Nepal, on the border of India and southern Nepal. Champaram was a place reeling in poverty because of the economic changes wrought by the new industrial military complex that we now call the First World War. The German chemical industry had come up with a synthetic indigo dye that meant that there was no market, the global market for indigo. It seems an unlikely place to begin a fight for British colonialism. But nonetheless, indigo farmers were being no longer had any place to sell their wares, their crops, and yet absentee British landlords still demanded the same rents. So they had no money, nowhere to sell their crops, and starvation was a fairly large problem. So this was the first place at which he began satyagraha. Could not get more specific, more out of the way, and other than the absentee British landlords and the immediate British administration in the district, there were no other British people in sight. The truth was that something was creating this new extreme situation of poverty for the vast majority of the farming population in Champaran. Another good example, much later, more than a decade later, also gets a big, nice long part of the film, is the 1930 Salt March. By this time, Gandhi's been in and out of jail throughout the 1920s. Again, the Quit India campaign, struggle for independence, has taken great shape. He's been in charge of the main political organ fighting for Indian independence, the Indian National Congress, for a decade at this point. He chooses, for this grand, probably the largest satyagraha campaign that he ever waged in India, he chooses an 1882 law enacted by the British that prohibits Indians from making salt locally. If any of you have been to India, you know you can't survive long in that heat without salt, but yet there's a complete British monopoly on the production of salt. So what does he do? As in the film that I hope you've all seen, he organizes a satyagraha campaign to convince the British that this law is unjust and therefore should be repealed. What I really want to focus on, though, is the sort of basic moral formation demanded by participation in these satyagraha campaigns. Because as I began my remarks with, the focus is always for Gandhi on the individual's ability, and these involved sometimes hundreds of thousands of people marched in the SALT campaign in 1930. If there was a single act of violence, a single satyagraha member, satyagrahi as they were called, a single one retaliated with violence, to violence inflicted upon them, he considered the entire campaign a failure. That everything rests, the sum, the whole is simply the sum of the individual parts. So the first thing to keep in mind when thinking about what made a satyagraha campaign work, its logic internally, was that if you have a notion of a relative truth, the current situation in Champaran is unjust, unfair, causes suffering. The SALT law of 1882 by 1930 clearly causes suffering. Then there is a single moral principle. Everything is negotiable except for a single moral principle, and that is ahimsa, literally non-harming, but reinterpreted by Gandhi into a much more positive, and he acknowledges the influence of Christian teaching in his renegotiating of ahimsa as a negative, a refusal to do harm, to a more positive force of love, or even compassion. He sometimes glosses ahimsa as compassion. That for him is the one absolute, both in terms, if the relative truth is open to negotiation based on the perceived, and you need to be open to being persuaded otherwise, that the SALT law of 1882 is actually just, that it actually would cause more harm not to repeal the law. The one absolute is gauging the level of violence or harm done to those concerned. It's about a gauge of the relative truth, the satya after which you are grasping, literally. It's also the gauge of conduct for all satyagrahis, all who participate in the satyagraha camps. So the demands placed upon those thousands who participated were tremendous, and Gandhi himself also tried very hard to set the sort of paradigm for behavior. Participation in a satyagraha campaign began with participation in often a month or 40-day long satyagraha camp of disciplinary training, of eating, of abstaining from any kind of sexual activity, of a whole range. There are many sort of first-person narratives of what life in a satyagraha camp was like, of communal living, of practicing nonviolence, of practicing strategies of education, of bodily physical disciplines, and in short, of mentally and physically preparing oneself to engage nonviolently in direct confrontation with people who want to do you harm. And there's some fabulous shots of this in the film, if you remember, of wave after wave in front of a factory, walking right up to policemen with lathis, sticks, who are beating them bloody. And then they're dragged away and the next wave goes up and does the same. So this requires an enormous amount of moral preparation. At the same time, the Satyagraha also engages from start to finish in constant education of the opponent, in this case the British administration in its various forms, of what their goals are. If you think you're grasping after a relative truth, you have to make the other side understand why you think that, what you think that relative truth is, and why you think it's in fact true. And always open to, and if you study Gandhi and Satyagraha campaigns in India led by Gandhi himself very carefully, you can see that in every single one of them, he's willing to negotiate what form that truth is. He actually really listens to the other side, listens to their concerns, and often adjusts the goals of the campaign midstream in this, so that the education is actually a back and forth conversation between the two parties throughout the entire event. And again, of course, there has to be the willingness, the absolute commitment to ahimsa in the actual action itself. And in the cases where there is even a single violation where somebody strikes back, again, Gandhi deems the entire event a failure, and in fact calls the whole thing off. How am I doing on time, Diana?
I forgot.
Okay.
Finish up what you have to say.
Okay, all right. All right.
It's awfully good.
All right. So, I'm a Gandhi fan. So anyway, so again, absolute, I mean, this is conflict resolution that demands both tremendous specificity and tremendous courage, right? Not only do you have to have complete sort of control and self-discipline and an absolute unwavering commitment to nonviolence, to non-harming, but you also have to have real courage. This is not something you can do in an armchair. You have to have the courage of your convictions and be willing, even if somebody's beating you over the head with a stick, to be willing to adjust your perception of what is true. So really do that is really demanding on the individual. So I thought I'd wrap it up by talking a little bit about the Gandhian legacy. Because many, I mean, I'll end with some of the criticisms of Gandhi that I think we ought to discuss. The Gandhian legacy in South Asia and even around the world, I'm sure it's well known that Martin Luther King, while in jail, letters from a Birmingham jail, became acquainted with Gandhian techniques and early civil rights actions, sit-ins at lunch counters, et cetera. They were trained in Gandhian nonviolent resistant techniques, et cetera. In South Asia, the legacy, I think, has been far broader than that and ongoing. Although I would say that in my just estimation of Gandhian activities today in India, for example, they are perhaps more well known as economic activities. Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank, for example, who put the idea of micro-lending into the international vocabulary of development, is a Gandhian through and through. Well known is the Gandhian women's organization called Sewa, or Service, in Ahmedabad, that's done everything from provide banking for poor women to education, training, industrial sorts of initiatives to train women to work in the new industries of the new economy in India, et cetera. More recently, more political agitations have included the unfortunately failed protests against the Narmada Valley Dam projects in Western India that flooded unbelievable numbers of both acres and displaced tens of thousands of people. There were a variety of celebrities were involved, a variety of very famous Indian novelists, for example. But there were many Gandhian satyagraha-like campaigns, peaceful acts of resistance to try to stop that dam project and its displacement. Perhaps one of my, I'll end with one of my personal favorites of this list is Vandana Shiva. I don't know how widely known she is in environmentalism. In 2008, along Gandhian lines, she launched a Bij Yatra, you know, about yatras, a pilgrimage to collect seeds. And from this came her Navdanya project, which has staged a number of satyagrahas in front of the offices of, among others, Monsanto, India, fighting the introduction of genetically modified crops and foodstuffs, for example. So there are a variety of Gandhian initiatives today. Now, there's also been much critique of Gandhi. And I work in a particular region, as my book titles make clear, the Tamil-speaking South, where, you know, there aren't many Gandhi margs, not many main streets named for Gandhi. His vision, particularly of low caste and Dalits, was often thought in his own lifetime to be extremely condescending, etc. Certainly the Hindu nationalist parties, the parties of the Hindu right that were re-elected to national power in May of this year are no friends of Gandhi. They thought he was far too ecumenical, gave away far too much to the Muslims who remained in India, etc. However, I think a much more potent critique about the relevance of Gandhian techniques today rests on the assumptions Gandhi made and that Satyagraha makes about human nature. Essentially, you need to have an opponent who is educable, who can be swayed by the display of nonviolent moral courage. The best example of this in the film, it's very quick if you remember the film, but nonetheless, is that one brief clip where Gandhi, as a young lawyer in South Africa, is burning identity cards. And he's getting beaten by an English policeman, a young policeman, who, as Gandhi's bloody, his blood's running down his face, and he's still reaching up to toss one more card in the fire. The camera moves for about 30 nanoseconds to the look of disbelief on the young policeman's face, and the idea that he stops beating him because he can't believe this young lawyer is doing this. The question is, would anybody on the beheading team in ISIL be moved by this? Would anybody in so many of the violent corners of the world today be moved in any way by the kind of display, even display on, what if I was asking myself as I was thinking about this, what if the entire population still left in Kobani in northern Syria actually stood up and engaged in a satyagraha campaign? Would the leaders of ISIL care? Would they stop? Would they be swayed by that display of moral courage? In the South Asian context, in something like Navdanya, you can see that, yes, in fact, people still is possible to sway people with the displays individually and en masse of moral courage, but I think it's a big question to discuss whether or not this is applicable in many parts of the world today. So, thanks. Over to Thich Nhat Hanh.
Leslie, I promise I will try to
I'm timing myself. Just kidding. It's my Zen monastic training has gotten me very well at taking time seriously. So thank you everybody for coming here tonight, and I feel very honored to be able to speak about Thich Nhat Hanh, and thank you for Professor Monius for such an excellent rendition of Gandhi, and for all of the organizers of this event. I lived with Thich Nhat Hanh for about 7 to 8 years in France and New York, as well as in different Asian monasteries when we would travel internationally. And I was a fully ordained nun with him, and I also served as his advisor, as Professor Eckhead had already shared with you. Oh yeah, you can't hear me? Can you hear me? Is that better? This is a problem Thich Nhat Hanh used to have too. Nobody used to be able to hear him when he gave public talks. Is that better? Okay. So I was just sharing that I used to be an advisor for Thich Nhat Hanh as well, for some of the mundane things like giving him tea. But then also I served as an editor for some of his books, and also when we would go on international tours, he would ask me to research the political, economic, and social climate of those particular areas so his talks to be relevant for whatever situation we were in at that time. And some of you may not know Thich Nhat Hanh. He doesn't have a movie yet. Although, on a side note, his book, Old Path, White Clouds, has been sold the rights to make a movie called The Buddha, which is supposed to be coming out soon. But for a little bit of the history of Thich Nhat Hanh, Thich Nhat Hanh was born in Hue, which is in central Vietnam, in 1926. And he was inspired to become a monk when he saw a photo of the Buddha at the age of 5. And he saw the peaceful expression of the Buddha both in his body and in appearance in his mind, and he was inspired to live that same kind of peace in his own life. So he ordained at the age of 16. And the name Thich Nhat Hanh was a name that was given to him by his teacher. It's not his birth name. And I want to break down the name for you so you can understand a little bit more about his path in life. So Thich is just an honorary title given to any monk. Nhat means one in Vietnamese, and Han means action. So his name means one action. And one action can have many different meanings. In Mahayana Buddhism, the one action is going into the world as a bodhisattva, as a being who's on a path to Buddhahood, to help all beings in whatever way that you can. It could be helping them in terms of giving them food or giving them shelter, or it could also be helping them on the path of realization and freedom. However, Thich Nhat Hanh has a different rendition of what that means, more specifically in the Zen tradition. And he described it once to me in terms of the Zen teachings about a box or about a square. If you see one corner of the square, then you, as a Zen practitioner, will see the rest of the three within that one. And that one action, then, is composed of mindfulness, precepts, and ethics is the first. The second is concentration within those ethical frameworks. And the third is wisdom, prajna, that comes about by those two aspects. And then from wisdom, you're motivated then to go into the world in social action in those various ways. To, again, offer food, shelter, or if it's more appropriate to offer teachings, then you proceed as needed. So that is his title, that is his life path, and it's been definite theme in his life from the time, even when he was a young monk in Vietnam to now in France. And as a young monk, he was sort of a revolutionist in a sense in terms of the internal Buddhist community. He wanted to modernize Buddhism. And so he struggled as a monk to receive the formal monastic practice, which included taking classes in sutra study, in classical Chinese, for example, and different Buddhist philosophy, with the actual practice of Buddhism, and then taking that practice and going out to the world. And what I mean by practice is sitting meditation, walking meditation, any practice that's through self-cultivation, and also developing relationships with your fellow monks and nuns. So he's often critical of his historical Buddhist universities who didn't practice the actual meditation aspect and building those relationships with each other, doing conflict resolution just within their friendships and with the community. So he formulated an entirely different view of Buddhism that was a combination of mindfulness practice, mindful walking, mindful sitting, mindful eating, and studies of Buddhist philosophy, in addition to bringing that outside into the world. And he grew up in a very difficult time in Vietnam. He describes bombs falling when he was a monk, and how difficult it was for him to stay within the meditation hall when you have bombs falling outside and people suffering. So he wanted to create a new kind of Buddhism that would allow him to engage in the world, but doing so as a Buddhist monk, as a form of meditation. So he creates he coins the term engaged Buddhism in about 1965. And at that time, Buddhism had a little more freedom in Vietnam. There was a bit of conflict with the Roman Catholic president at the time, the Diem regime, which prosecuted Buddhists. In about 1963, at the time of Vesak, the Buddhist birth anniversary, he would not allow any display of the Buddhist flags. And that definitely irritated the Buddhist community, and they arrested many monks and nuns, they prosecuted them, they tortured them, and as a result, a lot of monks and nuns self-immolated themselves the first time that they did that, and they continued to do that throughout the Vietnam War, just to show the world how difficult it is in that situation. So Thich Nhat Hanh has this new form of Buddhism called engaged Buddhism. And as an institution, he developed Van Han University and the School of Youth and Social Services, around that same time. Ban Han University was supposed to be a Buddhist university to educate leaders, to be more compassionate, to be more understanding, to have sympathy for the people around. And the Youth for Social Services is this nonviolent, young group of people who are trying to make social change. With very simple things, by providing food and shelter, medicine for people outside, and also bring awareness to the world of the deep suffering that's going on in Vietnam. So in that aspect, a year later after he started the university, he comes to Cornell University as a guest to talk about Vietnamese Buddhism. And at that time, it's the height of the Vietnam War. And he also uses that time to talk about the suffering in Vietnam. And he caught the attention of Martin Luther King Jr. at that time, who fell in love with his practices of peace and ended up nominating him for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1967. And just a little historical fact, they did not offer the Nobel Peace Prize to anyone that year. And it was very controversial that he did nominate Thich Nhat Hanh, because Thich Nhat Hanh, as soon as he spoke out about the suffering and wanting to end the war in Vietnam, was then exiled from Vietnam. So then he sought political asylum in France, which is where he later established what's called Sweet Potato Meditation Center, which is then called Plum Village Monastery, which is what is present today. And I wanted to share a little bit about the actual practices of engaged Buddhism, besides just the combination of the sitting and walking in combination with helping people out in the world. And I want to read something from the charter of this group, and it's called Order of Interbeing. And the interbeing in Buddhism is one of the main key insights, that this world is not just each of us individually acting by ourselves, that it's deeply interconnected. And so interbeing was then the wisdom that pushed people to go through social change and to help people, because it's not a duty to do something right, but it's coming from your own aspiration, just as if the other person is your right hand and it's helping the left. So he has a very, very deep insight into interbeing. So the Charter of Interbeing states that the OI rejects dogmatism in both looking and acting. It seeks all forms of action that can revive and sustain the true spirit of insight and compassion in life. It considers this spirit to be more important than any Buddhist institution or tradition. With the aspiration of the Bodhisattva, members of the Order of Interbeing seek to change themselves in order to change society in the direction of compassion and understanding by living a joyful and mindful life. So that is the first precept or ethical training for the Order of Interbeing. There are 13 other precepts, but they're all formulated around the core precepts of Buddhism. And for those of you familiar with them, there's 5 of them. They're across all Buddhist traditions. And similar to as Professor Monius was sharing about Gandhi, who changed the language into positive, Thich Nhat Hanh also did this as well. So usually it's no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, no lying, no drinking alcohol or drugs, etc. So he changes the language. And I'd like to share with you these 5 mindfulness trainings so you have an idea of what he's trying to cultivate. They all start with the awareness of the suffering of doing some sort of action. I vow to cultivate something within me to transform that. As he believes peace begins with oneself, extends then to one's family, extends then to society or who we work with in the workplace, and then extends into the larger world. So I'd just like to read these 5 trainings. So the first one, aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life. I'm committed to cultivating the insight of interbeing and compassion and learning ways to protect the lives of people, animals, plants, and minerals. I'm determined not to kill, not to let others kill, and not to support any act of killing in the world, in my thinking, or in my way of life. Seeing that harmful actions arise from anger, fear, greed, and intolerance, which in turn comes from dualistic and discriminative thinking. I will cultivate oneness, non-discrimination, and non-attachment to views in order to transform violence and dogmatism in myself and in the world. So very similar to ahimsa, as Professor Monius had shared. The second one is regarding exploitation. Aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing, and oppression, I'm committed to practicing generosity in my thinking, speaking, and acting. I'm determined not to steal, not to possess anything that should belong to others, and I will share my time, energy, and material resources with those in need. I will practice looking deeply to see that the happiness and suffering of others are not separate from my own happiness and suffering, and that true happiness is not possible without understanding and compassion, and that running after wealth, fame, power, and sensual pleasures can bring much suffering and despair. The third training is regarding sexual misconduct. aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I'm committing to cultivating responsibility and learning ways to protect the safety and integrity of individuals, couples, families, and society. Knowing that sexual desire is not love and that sexual activity motivated by craving always harms myself and others, I'm determined not to engage in sexual relations without true love and a deep long-term commitment known to family and friends. I will do everything in my power to protect children from sexual abuse and to prevent couples and families from being broken by sexual misconduct. And the fourth training is awareness of speech. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and the inability to listen to others. I'm committed to cultivating loving speech and compassionate listening in order to relieve suffering and promote reconciliation and peace in myself and among other people, ethnic and religious groups and nations. Knowing that words can create happiness or suffering, I'm committed to speaking truthfully, using words that inspire confidence, joy, and hope. When anger is manifesting in me, I'm determined not to speak. I will practice mindful breathing in order to reconcile and to look deeply into my anger. And the last training is about mindful consumption. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful consumption, I'm committed to cultivating good health, physical and mental, for myself, family, and society by practicing mindful eating, drinking, and consuming. I will practice looking deeply into how I consume the 4 kinds of nutriments, namely edible foods, sense impressions, volition, and consciousness. I'm determined not to gamble, use alcohol, drugs, or any other products that contain toxins, such as websites, games, TV programs, films, conversations. I will practice coming back to the present moment and be in touch with the refreshing, healing, and nourishing elements in me and around me. So those 5 mindfulness trainings make up the backbone of mindfulness practice for Thich Nhat Hanh. And cultivating those trainings requires 2 things: stopping and looking deeply into our actions. And stopping requires us to take an in-breath and an out-breath. And that is his formula for peace. Cultivating stopping, and then once stopping, looking to see where things like anger come from, where things like despair come from, and learning how to transform them and looking deeply within ourselves. And then following the formula for peace in oneself, peace in the world, then making change one step at a time. And his main formula, again, from the breath, is to build communities, to build sanghas who practice this, who practice the 5 mindfulness trainings, and who share these practices with their friends, families, and transform schools, transform workplaces, and government agencies, schools. And so that is his main practice now. Unfortunately, he's not well at the moment, but his monasteries in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, all are formed from these 5 mindfulness trainings, and they have monastics and lay practitioners who work together to lead retreats for various sectors in the world, politicians, even entertainers. I met a very famous producer once in LA who was working with Thich Nhat Hanh on nonviolent films, and working with universities. I myself lead a movement called Wake Up, which is to share these teachings for young adults and young professionals in universities to cultivate it in their studies. So.
You did it. 14 minutes and 12 seconds. General discussion in a few minutes, but first we have a couple of people who are going to offer a few brief remarks on this. Joseph Lumbard first.
Thank you.
You want to stand
Want me
up?
to stand up?
Sure.
All right. Well, I was, thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, I specialize in Islamic studies, and unlike colleagues that we've had speak before, I try to avoid the modern world. As I once had a piano teacher who said that I really should not have been born after the year 1600. And so when I approach topics such as peace and conflict resolution, I really do it from the perspective of my specialties are really as a medievalist and really as a scholar of the Quran. And I've actually been thinking a lot about this as regards the Quran in recent months, and said when you look at the Quran, it really comes through as it can really be read as a document of peace and conflict resolution, from its very beginnings up until some of the very last verses. And this is one of the reasons why there's such a prevalent element of conflict within the Quran, is because the Quran is acknowledging that conflict is going to exist among human beings, and that there must be some way to overcome it, that it needs to be addressed to some extent. And that's why one of the very last verses of the Quran to be revealed in the chronological order, it says, this is verse 5:8 of the Quran, it states, "O you who believe, be steadfast for God, bearing witness to justice, and let not hatred for a people lead you to be unjust. Be just, that is nearer to reverence." The word here, reverence, is taqwa. It could also be rendered mindfulness. And in fact, some translators actually render it that way. So that is closer to mindfulness. And be mindful of God. Surely God is aware of whatsoever you do. It's actually very significant that this comes at the end, because this verse is said to have come right after the time of the conquest of Mecca. That is, after the Prophet Muhammad had emerged to be victorious over those who had essentially oppressed his people for many years. And in fact, when one goes through that particular chapter of the Quran, which is chapter 5, or Surah 5 as it's known, it's also the chapter that has the famous verse 548 of the Quran, which is one of the most often cited verses when it comes to discussions of conflict resolution, or when it comes to discussions of interfaith dialogue, where it says that God created people as different people so that they might come to know one another, and implies that these differences in pursuits and these differences of perspectives are going to be part and parcel of the human condition, and how one overcomes them is essential to really the test of what it is to be human. And there are other verses of the Quran that allude to this as well, that we have created you, and it literally states, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, to test you as to which ones of you are ahsan, or most virtuous or best in the deeds that you perform. And this word, ahsana, ends up being essential, as we end up often talking about Islam in terms of the word Islam, or in terms of the word Iman, and then Islam comes to be related to the particular actions that one performs, and so with the law of Islam. And then Iman comes to be associated with particular creeds. But ihsan is often recognized as the third part, and this is also based upon the teachings of the Prophet and how he would explain the religion to his followers. And in one famous saying, the Prophet is actually, he is asked, what is ihsan, this doing beautiful or being virtuous? And he says, it's to worship God as if you see God, for if you do not see God, he nonetheless sees you. And so in a sense, it's to be mindful of God at every single moment, in every single thing that one does. Now, commenting upon the relationship between Islam, submission, the law, Iman, faith, the realm of creed, and ihsan, or virtue, a famous Sufi commentator, Sarraj, he said in one of the most widely read books of Sufism. For those of you who don't know Sufism, you can ask Professor Ali Hassani over there about it. He knows it better than I do. But it's really the realm of Islamic mysticism, one might say, which is not the best translation, but we'll leave it at that for now. But commenting upon it, he says that Islam is the outer, Iman is the inner, and ihsan, being virtuous, or literally doing that which is beautiful, is the reality of the inner and the outer, meaning that it is what pervades the whole thing. And when one comes down, it's very interesting that when one looks, to leapfrog into the modern period, of which I don't apparently wish to be a part, existentially in some way, but it's where we all are, is that in this period, one of the things that we witness with, for example, what's happened in Libya. In Libya, the Al-Qaeda offshoots that were there, one of the first things that they were doing was going out and wiping out Sufi groups. 2 days before the strike on the Twin Towers of 9/11, Al-Qaeda killed Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was, in a sense, the most viable alternative representative of traditional Islam in Afghanistan. The same thing when you see what the Wahhabis have done when they went into Central Asia. They wiped out the Naqshbandiya Sufi order that had actually been putting up, you might say, a principled resistance to Russian control. And from there, after they wiped out the Naqshbandi orders, it's from there that they were then able to launch particular campaigns, terrorist campaigns and attacks within other parts of Central Asia. And so it's been a slow process of really wiping out these representatives of the Ihsan movement, or what I've called in some of my writings the kind of the Ihsani tradition, or one could say also the Ihsani intellectual tradition, that has actually in many ways led to a situation in many parts of the Islamic world where, you might say, more extremist elements are seen as the solution, and many of the more traditional solutions that were inherent to the Islamic world are no longer being sought. And this is where I think that within the context of the Islamic world, going into a really, truly, almost literalist, I mean, a real literalist Quranic reading, not one where you try to kind of just pick and choose the verses, but a real literalist one where one puts all of these things together, then you actually can find a real way to find peace and conflict resolution as something that was fundamentally central to the campaign of the Prophet. And I'll just end with this one famous hadith of the Prophet that is often considered by traditional scholars of Islam to be axiomatic to Islam. In the Hanafi school of Islamic law, they actually say that this is one of the principles that you use to define how you interpret other aspects of the law. And the hadith is la darar wa la dirara, which means there is no harm and there is no requiting harm. And ultimately, if it comes down to that at the end of the day, one could, you might say that all peace and conflict resolution could be found in that one saying. I'm keeping my comments short because I'm not one of the main presenters, but that's just my contribution from the world of Islam. Thank you.
Where's Liz here? You're behind. Okay, so also brief remarks on Islam in relation to this. Liz, are you learning it now? Yes, that would be great. Do you want to come up here so we can all see you?
Come on, Liz, if we had to go up there.
Yeah, everybody has to go.
Fairness, an important virtue. So, I'd like just to talk a bit about the importance of this emphasis on virtue and its cultivation in the Islamic tradition. When I first started learning about the Islamic tradition, I was really struck by how pervasive it is and how strong it is. There's been a very strong, continuous tradition of teaching and practice and pedagogy from the early Islamic period, one could say, in the Quran, in the sayings of the Prophet, and very early on, even when the hadith that became the canonical hadith started to be written, around that time, even as early as the 9th century, we have works that are collections of hadith and sayings of the Prophet and other saintly people, organized around specific virtues that clearly indicate that people were studying these and trying to cultivate these and teaching these. So for example, Ibn Abil Dunya, that's one. It's kind of an expansion of literatures based on the beautiful character traits of the Prophet Muhammad. And then also in the 9th century, we have quite sophisticated writings of moral psychology on self-examination and distinguishing between the different impulses and voices and really the different forms of the ego and satanic impulses within oneself that one has to separate out in order to be the kind of virtuous person. And it's incredible to really see this in the 9th century. Following that, you could say that there's a really culmination of this by the late 11th, early 12th century in Imam al-Ghazali, who's very, very famous. His work, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, which might be better translated, Giving Life to the Religious Sciences, it has been taken by Muslims as really a very standard mainstream work explaining the synthesis of all the different aspects of the Islamic tradition. And it's probably known as the most famous spiritual masterpiece and important work in the Islamic tradition after the Quran and the Hadith by many people. It was said that if all knowledge were lost, all Islamic knowledge were lost, and only this remained, it will be sufficient. And it's a 40-volume work, and if you look at the content, it's very remarkable, the emphasis on virtues and their cultivation. So if you look, it's broken into 4 quarters, each with 10 chapters. The first talks about devotional practice and ritual. The second about conduct and behavior. And both of those focus very much on the outer dimension and the inner dimension. There tends not to be this dichotomous polarization between the two, despite the fact that that language of inner and outer is very prominent. It's much more, as Professor Sachiko Murata has said, more of like a yin-yang type of perspective. So those are highly emphasized in that first whole half. The second half of the book, the 20 remaining volumes, are actually on qualities themselves. They're dedicated to that. The third quarter on the qualities that you need to eliminate: anger, hatred, greed, etc. And then the fourth section on the qualities that you need to cultivate: trust in God, patience, gratitude, all these kinds of things. So that's just to say that already by the early 12th century, and really what's considered representative of traditional and classical Islamic teachings, this is really a very, very strong emphasis. One of the aspects that's very strong in the Quran and very interesting from this conflict resolution point of view, I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned to look at it that way, is the concept of looking at people in terms of their substantive qualities and not in terms of groups, specifically saying people are not all alike in groups and religious groups, and everybody is understood to be on a trajectory of moral and spiritual development, and no one knows where anyone will end up. So it puts you in kind of a position of humility and also having to think well of other people and also their potential. And one of the principles is that actually, people know Imam Ashafa from Nigeria. I had the fortune of meeting him a number of years ago, and one of the things I think scholars of religion can really do that's helpful is to ask about the spiritual, ethical backstory of some of these great peacemakers and what's really driving them, because you'll really find a lot. So I had an opportunity to say, so what was it from the Quran that this preacher said that made you suddenly change, or not suddenly, but made you really start to change from thinking that your duty was to fight the Christians to feeling that your sacred duty was to join with them to make peace? And he said these verses that had always really been central to me from the conflict resolution perspective in the Quran, which is goodness and evil are not equal. So repel evil with what is better. Respond to bad with what is better and more beautiful, using this term that Professor Lumbard mentioned, what is ahsan, the same verse, and then the one between you and whom, actually it says you and whom, so you first, is enmity will become like an intimate friend. But none will attain this except those who exercise patience, none but those who have the greatest good fortune. And if any kind of insinuation or incitement to discord comes to you from Satan, seek refuge in God. He's the one who hears and knows all things. So this is the kind of formula where it's recognizing human beings, and scholars have written on this, as people who are intrinsically created good with a natural disposition to goodness, and that the concept is that generally people are influenceable by responding, but it takes a lot of patience and continual overtures, the kinds of things that we saw Imam Ashafa do in his early relationship with the pastor, but it can't always be the case, and then you have to seek refuge in God when that's not the case. So this focus on key virtues and thinking of the religious path in terms of virtues, things like loving God and loving all humanity. There's a saying attributed to the prophet that all creations are God's family, and God loves best those who are best to his family. And so this kind of thinking has been very important in some of the people who were important leaders of peace, including, for example, Badshah Khan in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, who was a friend of Gandhi and also inspired by Gandhi, and raised a nonviolent army of some 100,000 men and women who called themselves servants of God, saying that because God needs no service, we're going to serve God by serving all of his creations. But he focused specifically on certain virtues that people needed to focus on cultivating: certitude, love, and service, which are all Quranic terms. So this has been very important in the practice of peacemaking in Islam. And also, I wanted to I noted in reading memoirs of Professor Leila Ahmed and also Fatima Mernisi, it was very interesting that in describing the lived religiosity and spiritual ethics of women and just ordinary people, I believe Professor Ahmed called it the garden variety of Islam that she would encounter, grew up with, and then would encounter among meeting many Muslims, that there tended to be a focus on certain key values and virtues and principles, and then flexibly applying them and having a real kind of tolerance for and acceptance of differences and diversity, and a sense of unity despite differences of ethnicity and religion. And that kind of thinking has been very influential in the Islamic tradition, to the point that there have been really major institutional correlates of that, one of them being Sufi institutions that, for example, in South Asia is just one excellent example, that have created devotional centers that are welcoming to all people, whatever religion, sect, rank, caste, gender. One of the leaders of one of these institutions, of the Chishtiya, recently there was a commemoration at the United Nations that that India had, really saying that this had contributed a great deal to interfaith harmony and pluralism over the years. Said the mentality was, we don't ask your religion, just come with a heart full of love. So love is a unifying factor, a recognition of a kind of spiritual unity, what you might call maybe an ecumenical universalism, has really been a consciously cultivated type of ethic that has really been manifested in these major institutions. This particular Chishtiya tradition was started in the 12th century, and so they were just commemorating 800 years of this. And when the current leader was talking about this, he mentioned that this really is it's still a living, very much a living tradition, and one that's seen as carrying on the way of the Prophet, integrally the way of the Prophet. And here in the United States, we have, again, Sufi groups that manifest this as well, but also in contexts where people don't necessarily explicitly identify themselves as Sufi, you also see a similar focus on values and virtues. One of the examples of a Sufi organization that Professor Eck asked me to mention is the Bao Mahayadeen Fellowship. Bao Mahayadeen being a Sufi sage who came from Sri Lanka in 1971 and set up the same type of devotional center that's open to people of all different religious backgrounds, as a kind of pond of wisdom where people focus on trying to transform their qualities, seeing the qualities of God being the way to connect with God, and a main dictum being, if you separate away from yourself, that which separates you from other people, then you'll never be separate from God, who treats all equally. And a teaching about Islam as, in its very original meaning, as a state of being, and trying to cultivate what that state of being is, and otherwise not being able to lay claim to it. He would define it as loving all lives as your own, so it becomes a very hard thing to claim. And finally, I'd just like to close by saying that there have been real effects in conflict situations that we've seen of this kind of ethic when it's consciously cultivated in communities. There's a great book by Anna Bigelow called Sharing the Sacred on Malakotla in Punjab, India. And this town was founded by a Sufi saint in the 15th century. And then there was an event where the virtue of impartial justice was displayed, where a Muslim ruler, Aurangzeb, was threatening to brick the children of the Sikh guru into a wall. And the Muslim leader of the area, who was affiliated with this, said, and was actually a relative of the person who was threatening to do this, said that this was against the tenets of Islam, this was against just what was right, and had a cry for justice, as a result of which the Sikh guru then blessed the area. So this has been something cultivated in the historical memory of the place and in efforts to keep it as an area of pluralism and tolerance, such that when there was partition in 1947 between India and Pakistan, when that region was really awash in violence, this area, this town, they didn't have any incidents of violence, and there were no killings there. So I'd just like to mention three things that I think, in terms of our lenses, as scholars of religion, thinking about these issues have hampered us, and that if we can shift them, would really help us very much in thinking about virtue cultivation and conflict transformation. One is, to date, really the lack of recognition of the dimension of virtues and values in their cultivation in our theoretical framework for thinking about the normative aspects of religion. People often mention orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Certainly in the Islamic tradition, this is, as Professor Lumbard said, a third pillar that is huge, and even for understanding those first two, you really can't do it without the virtue piece. Second is our not taking sufficiently seriously, as Professor Ahmed has said, the lived religiosity and spiritual ethics of women and ordinary people, instead treating it as marginal, although by definition it's been predominant, even if not officially dominant, in terms of people's experience. And then finally, the fact of phenomena that occur at the intersection of religions, such as this kind of ecumenism, that even though people are aware of it, it seems to be somewhat invisible in terms of not sufficiently informing the way we think about religion itself, due to not really fitting a silo model of separate religions that usually characterizes scholars' default thinking. It's an area that the emerging field of interfaith studies will hopefully help address. And I took many more minutes than I had intended to do, and I apologize for that.
Thank you, Liz. Liz has invited a couple other people to give some comments. Janet Gyatso, yes, please, Professor of Buddhist Studies.
Well, so many issues have been raised already, so I hesitate to bring up anything else. But I'll just stick to what Elizabeth asked me to do, was just to give one example in a kind of focused way of a kind of cultivation practice and exercise that is used at the very, very fundamental level of creating even the condition of possibility of having these sorts of virtues altogether. So this is a very well-known practice, especially in Tibetan Buddhism. It comes out of Indian Buddhism, a very particular text from the 8th century, Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, and the practice is called exchanging self and other, or you might call it something like trading places. It's primarily an exercise of the imagination, so it comes very much out of a meditative tradition. It would be something that one would think about in a kind of quasi-meditative state, whereby one tries to see the horizons of other people from their perspective. And one tries to see the desires, the perspective of the other through an exercise of active imagination. And then the second part of it, which I think is also really interesting, is that you also especially in a more advanced kind of practice, you also train yourself to begin to discern how others see you. So there is a way of training yourself to sort of get outside of your subjective inner state and sort of see yourself from the outside, which presumably has, or is thought to have, a very positive effect on your entire moral being and way of acting. The way these things are talked about as general exercise, this is the kind of thing that would be given to students in a monastery or in many different kinds of Buddhist practice situations. It's talked about as being something that's very, very, very hard to do. And yet at the same time, so even if you're just doing this in your imagination alone, you're not actually acting on it, even to imagine things from the perspective of others, even just to drop your own personal perspective, even for just a few moments, and actually see something from another point of view is an extremely hard thing to do. And just to give one example, which is not exactly the same thing, but it's close enough, so these are the kinds of exercises. I heard a Tibetan teacher once talking about how to cultivate the virtue of generosity, and then emphasizing how hard it is to give up those very precious objects that we have and our own wealth and goods and giving them to others. And so, as one of my students from my class has already heard this, but advise the exercise of taking something very precious of your own, say a piece of jewelry, and holding it in your hand and how much you like that, and just simply practice dropping it into your other hand. So you're not really giving it to anyone else, but the mere fact of just letting it go for a moment somehow exercises a muscle that kind of gets you in the habit of being able to just like let it go, even though you know it's going to land in your own other little left hand, so to speak. Not that particular example. Yeah, he's not thinking about jewelry. He's like he's very much of a monk. A kind of standard practice for exchanging self and other in terms of learning how to see the perspective of others might be a meditation in which you think about other people who are sick, and you at least imagine wishing that you would take on their sickness and they would get better. And so a meditative practice in which you actually, every time you breathe in, you imagine, say there is an ill person that you know about, you're breathing in their illness and getting very ill, taking on their illness and relieving them of their illness. And what's implicit in that is the idea that you have the strength to take it on. You, as a super healthy person, actually have the ability to take on this illness where they, really are in need of relief, but you yourself have the ability to take it on. That itself, it's a very hard thing to do too. Especially in this time of year, I'm not breathing in anybody's illness. I have plenty of my own. Yeah, right, exactly. But then, a harder version of the exercise is to imagine someone who you really dislike, or a personal enemy. And being able to, it could be the same sickness example, or any type of imaginative exercise where you sit there, okay, this is a person who really bothers me, who's really against me, who really is trying to put me down all the time. And just sit there imagining that person having the greatest of success and happiness and recognition in the world. And that it's taking away also all of the success and recognition that you have. And you're saying, I give it to that other person. In the process, what you're forced to do is to recognize that that person has desires. I mean, that's one of the things that's very hard to see, actually, when you're conceiving of somebody as an enemy, is actually seeing that it is coming from somewhere. I mean, there's obviously a limit to this, and gives us, which is something that we have to, sort of in the face of real and true evil, but maybe even there's a room for that. But anyway, what I'm just trying to talk about, this is a kind of exercise that one is doing just simply to be able to imagine and just, come to terms with the perspective of where the other person, where the other side is coming from. It's just a very, very difficult thing to do. I just think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Janet. Charlie, would you like to come in at this point or come in later? Okay, so now we're going to have a more general conversation, I think, and that means that we can entertain some thoughts. And since we have, a few minutes, I would like to pose a couple of questions too. We have the list of questions, but I just want to say in relation to Thich Nhat Hanh that those of us who are of a certain age, and I'm definitely of that age, came to know Thich Nhat Hanh during the turbulence of the war in Vietnam. In fact, the first book I ever read about Buddhism was Lotus in a Sea of Fire, which was his sort of offering at the time of the immolations in Thich Quang Duc in Vietnam, who was the first to burn himself in the intersection in Saigon, I guess it was, or was it Hue? But at that point, Thich Nhat Hanh was saying, we wanted some kind of reconciliation, but they thought that because because we were working with the Americans, the communists killed us, and because the anti-communists killed us because they thought we were with the communists, and the people were really the people who were suffering. But that ability to describe both sides of the suffering, I think, is one of the difficult things, and that is just what you've been pointing to, Janet, also. I think in assigning students some aspects of Thich Nhat Hanh's writings, the one that they always find the most difficult are some of the poems in which, and I'm talking about Call Me By My True Names, which is an extraordinary piece. And I'll just read you 3 verses of it because I was thinking of it in relation to tonight. I am a mayfly metamorphosing on the surface of the river, and I am the bird that swoops down to swallow the mayfly. I'm a frog swimming happily in the clear water of a pond, and I am the grass snake that silently feeds on the frog. I am the 12-year-old girl, a refugee in a small boat, who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by the sea pirate. And I am that pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. But that sense of, it also builds upon what you talked about interbeing, that there is no separating the suffering of the young girl who has been raped and throws herself into the sea in an act of suicide, and the pirate, supposedly, as they're in this boat to escape from Vietnam, the pirate who rapes her. But to be able, that's a hard one to see from both standpoints. And this is a little of Gandhi's dilemma, too. How to see that there's a human being on both sides of what is a tragedy, what is a conflict. That challenge to see humanity on both sides, this is very difficult. And anyone want to come in here? Because I think this places us in the conflicts that we really live. Yes. Go ahead.
So based on that poem from
Yeah.
Thich Nhat Hanh, there's a practice he cultivated called touching the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And he was so distraught at the time in Vietnam that in order to survive, he made this practice, in order to mentally survive. He practiced touching the earth using this poem and additional verses in order just to keep some mental sanity every day. So he would touch the earth and say, I am one with the sea pirate, I am one with the person who's raped, and then to bring that over to all of the suffering that was going on in Vietnam. And he also changed it during 9/11. He happened to be in New York at the time, and practiced, I am the people who want to kill the Americans, and I am the Americans, and trying to reconcile both sides. And the monasteries practice this on a daily basis in the morning. It's part of their meditation practice to do this. But he said that was the hardest practice that he's ever done in his life.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit of an extension of the things that you have talked about, Janet. In a very difficult extension. Yes.
I'm struck in listening to all of these things by sort of what I see as 2 maybe complementary aims. And one of them is virtue cultivation within different traditions, sort of in the communities of these traditions, right? In the practicing communities. And one of them is understanding how studying this kind of virtue cultivation can help inform peace-building actors and organizations that come from these traditions. And I think those are both great ideas, and they're kind of complementary but a little bit distinct. And in terms of the latter, I really like the way there's so much on all of these topics we've been talking about from lots of different academic disciplines. Even right here within Harvard with, your Mind-Body Institute and their 3 deep breaths technique that they've got that totally changes people's hormonal balance, which is really key if you're dealing with conflict situations where people need to be thinking clearly. And then you've got your Roger Fisher department and Sheila Heen in their book, The Difficult Conversations book, which takes right on that whole stepping into somebody else's story bit. And it takes right on dealing with your emotions so that your emotions aren't interfering with your objectivity, and talking about the different stress hormones that can make us completely unable to see and hear, if our hormonal imbalance in our brain isn't right, and how to focus on that. And you've got a psychologist right here at Harvard who does that Making Caring Common project, Richard Weisbord or something, who's all about teaching empathy. How actually parents can model and teach empathy in children. And to me, that empathy piece is also a particularly key one, and it's sort of the heart of a lot of what we've been talking about, and connectivity. And you've got the UC Davis people out, in California, their cell biology department, talking about earthing, and how if you just spend 45 minutes barefoot every day, it changes the chemistry of your blood and reduces inflammation. If you have a potted plant in your cubicle, you're less depressed and less likely to get sick, this sort of thing. And so I'd love to see practices from within faith traditions, such as the Methodist tradition of the disciplines and the habits, the holy habits, And I think there's plenty of resources within traditions that could interface. Even in the field of ethics, you've got this whole huge field of virtue ethics now, this big emphasis on it. But it's getting that into the faith communities, and it's getting the connections among all of these different fields that are studying virtue cultivation from their own angles, and getting that
But
information.
of course, part of these people, they want to measure it also. They want to measure virtue cultivation, see how much, how it can be quantified, and maybe that's possible too. But I think the issue of cultivation that so many people have used, it is a practice. These are not simply things that we can say, gee, these are great virtues, generosity, etc. Yeah.
These are two sort of disparate thoughts that I think I heard in both of the main presentations. Or observations. One is just, I think each of you in your own way sort of made two things sort of equal that not everyone always would, which was you called conflict resolution types of activities that we're probably more used to calling social action or activism or whatever, and I think that's very appropriate. I think that that is peacemaking. When it has a sort of, and this is the second point of something that I think you've touched on, when it has, you both talked about, Leslie, you talked about sort of the no dogmatism as part of the precepts, right? And Professor Monius, I think you talked about Gandhi saying everything's negotiable except this truth. There's this kind of absence of fixed views, and I think when the social action is connected to that sort of disposition, you get social action as peacemaking, as we see in their work. But to that sort of absence of fixed view, I think that's developing that takes the discipline of these practices, contemplative practices, reflective practices, and so forth. Anyway, not a super well-formed thought, but
yeah. It's interesting. In Sufism, they actually say that the highest spiritual station is what they call the station of no station.
Say it again.
In Sufism, they say that the highest spiritual station is the station of no station.
Station of no
which you could also call the perspective of no perspective, in a sense, so that one has that kind of that flexibility to go around to every other and see things from every other perspective. But just like you were saying before about training, it comes through. It is acknowledged that it comes through constant training, and a constant, as they say, taking on the divine attributes within Sufism.